A snap general election is coming, but Boris Johnson is eminently beatable. People shouldn't be rattled or discombobulated. The result of an election, which seems very likely as things stand in October, is not certain. Now, I'm not saying Labour don't have problems now. I think we've all noticed that they do. However, Boris Johnson is far less popular than Theresa May. The Tories are not miles ahead in the polls in the same way as before. And the no-deal Brexit, which is what Boris Johnson is driving this country towards, most people in the country reject it. So how do Labour go after him? Well, firstly, they have to pin on him hard, ruthlessly, that he's a man who only stands up for his own, a man who champions the rich, the establishment, the elites, the 1% incarnate. What has to be repeated over and over and over again is that you cannot trust Boris Johnson. All Boris Johnson cares about is himself. This is a man who was sacked twice by his newspaper, by his former party leader, for dishonesty. He's a man who wrote 2 columns, Remain and Leave, on the same day, because all he cared about when it came to Brexit is how it advanced his own political ambitions. So, for example, this announcement on NHS funding, well, it turns out that the money is mostly not even new in the first place. And that should be fit in a frame of, you can't trust Boris Johnson. He makes a promise, but it's not based on any honesty at all. Another line of attack that has to be constantly focused on is that this is a government which is at war with values that millions of people hold dear. There's not one LGBTQ person in the cabinet, but there are lots of politicians in that cabinet who have opposed the rights of LGBTQ people and, for example, oppose abortion. And in one case, oppose LGBTQ inclusive education. And when it comes to the supposed optimism exuded by Boris Johnson, instead that should be portrayed as the recklessness of the upper classes, of the rich, who are leaving this country veering, careering wildly, and they will not suffer the consequences when it crashes. Now, one of the fears amongst senior Labour figures is now that Johnson is talking about splashing money around, that the kind of anti-austerity position of Labour will be blunted. But all that shows is Labour need to be more radical. And I quite liked it. Needs to be more radical.
Yeah,
Ding! Yeah. He says Labour need to be more radical, and they need to frame their spending commitments as taking on vested interests. So it's about saying, we're going to pay for this by taking on these wealthy interests and forcing them to pay money which they should be paying. The kind of class war politics, if you like, that Bernie Sanders in the United States has so successfully popularised. What about Labour's alternative? Well, Labour has to avoid falling into a trap set by Boris Johnson of trying to portray them as pessimistic, as unambitious, as dour, as gloomy. Instead, Labour should constantly be talking about the optimism of their message, about finally freeing Britain from the corset of austerity, unleashing the potential that's being held back of the country and of its people. It's not some pie in the sky or an attempt to career the country off some sort of no-deal cliff. It's a tangible promise of saying that by taking on the vested interests at the top, that will provide the wealth and the resources to transform society. Labour should spend the summer picking those fights. Why not, for example, commit to abolishing private education? Why not take on, I don't know, scrapping the honour system? Just things which resonate with people, which show that Labour's on the side of, as their slogan puts it, the many rather than the few. The climate emergency. The polling shows that, rightly, a large majority of people think it's more important than Brexit. We are talking about an existential threat facing humanity, so that's kind of important. Now, Labour should be really ambitious about it, coming up with really radical proposals that show that Labour would offer the most radical, decisive commitment to tackling the climate emergency, but also make it tangible in terms of how it will transform people's lives. Better public transport, cleaner air, creating jobs, taking on the housing crisis, all things which mean creating a more green, sustainable and just society. Now, as for Corbyn himself, there'll be people who go, oh, look at his polling, look at his personal ratings, yada, yada, yada. Just firstly, whatever you think of the man himself, he isn't going anywhere. That's just not going to happen. And remember, before the last election, how catastrophic his polling was. Before the 2017 election, Corbyn had lower personal ratings in Britain than Donald Trump did in Britain. That's how bad it was. Look, I despaired at the time. I did an entire video giving up on the guy. But I think what we saw in the last election was the more people saw of him and the more he went out as a campaigner, and that's his big strength, going out on the stump campaigning, the more he could mobilise people or help mobilise people to knock on doors and spread Labour's message, the more people liked him. And the more people saw May, the less they liked her, by way of contrast. And then there's the B word, Brexit. Oh my word. I mean, I just thought I could get through an entire video without talking about it, but that's not going to be possible. We know already that a lot of people who voted in 2017 for Labour have defected to the Greens and Lib Dems, not least over Brexit. Now, it would be easy, but I think a mistake, for Labour to just kind of menace those voters. Go, well, suck it up, because if you don't vote for us, you are just going to end up with Boris Johnson and no deal. And I think the way Labour can win back votes from the Lib Dems and Greens is to show that they offer the most inspiring alternative to the Tory and Tory Brexiteer project. In theory, at least, I know it's been a slightly tumultuous few years, but it could be a 5-year parliament, which means it will have to be addressing everything from the housing crisis to the stagnating living standards in this country, to the fact that now 1.9 million pensioners live in poverty, the fact that child poverty is growing. All of these issues have to be dealt with. We can't just spend the rest of our lives just allowing Britain's relationship with the European Union to overwhelm all of that. But it does also, of course, there is the question of those who voted Labour and voted for Leave. Now, that if you voted Leave and you support the Labour Party, you give far less priority to Brexit than other pro-Brexit voters. So what Labour has to say to those voters is, look, we've certainly tried to make this work and we've taken a massive political cost for doing so, and you will still get your opportunity if you wish to leave the EU in a final deciding referendum. But what about these other issues that matter to you? What about your kids not getting an affordable home? What about the fact your local public services are under massive strain? What about the growing waiting lists in the NHS? What about the fact that you're worried about having security and dignity in retirement? These are all issues that Labour have to prioritise, which will be difficult in a country which is as divided and polarised as this on Brexit.